When you hear the title Mermaid, you probably imagine something magical, maybe something poetic, maybe even romantic. But the moment I started looking into Tyler Cornack's latest film, I realized very quickly that this movie is aiming for something very different. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't even a traditional creature movie. What Cornack seems to be building here is a bizarre, uncomfortable, sometimes hilarious exploration of obsession, loneliness, and the strange chaos of Florida itself. And if that sounds like an odd combination, that's because it absolutely is. Before we begin, would you please support me? Subscribing is free and very important to me. For better analysis and more videos, please subscribe and like. The movie opens in a way that immediately tells us what kind of experience we're about to get. The first scene plays like a parody of Jaws. We're out at sea, the tone feels tense, something terrible is clearly about to happen, and the audience expects a classic monster movie moment. But just when things start building toward that familiar horror setup, the film suddenly interrupts itself with a title card calling the story a love letter to Florida right away. The film makes it clear that it's not trying to play by normal rules, and honestly, that's probably the best way to describe the entire project. Instead of a polished genre film, Mermaid feels like a strange collision of ideas. There's organized crime operating out of a strip club. There's a bizarre fish-like creature that devours people. And at the center of all of this chaos is a man who might be the least qualified hero you could imagine. His name is Doug. When we first meet Doug, played by Johnny Pemberton, he's already at a pretty low point in his life. He works at a nightclub, and within moments of appearing on screen, he's being fired. The reason is almost ridiculous. The club owner blames Doug for an absurdly expensive aquarium installation that turned out to be a terrible investment. Doug doesn't argue, he doesn't protest. He just sort of accepts the situation with a strange numbness, and that reaction tells us a lot about who this character is. Doug is drifting through life, barely holding things together. He's addicted to Percocet, and that addiction has already damaged the relationships that matter most to him. His young daughter barely sees him as reliable, and his former partner has clearly lost patience with the version of Doug that exists right now. What's interesting is that the film doesn't rush to explain all of this. Instead, the story moves forward with a slow, almost detached rhythm. It's the kind of pacing that makes the audience feel like they're watching someone stumble through their own life without really understanding what's happening. Then the movie introduces its most unexpected element. Doug discovers the creature. At first glance, it looks like a mermaid, but any comparison to traditional fantasy stories ends there. This thing isn't elegant. It isn't beautiful. It isn't even particularly mysterious. The creature, brought to life through an impressive physical performance by movement artist Avery Potemry, looks disturbing from the moment it appears. Doug manages to sedate the creature and takes it home. Yes, seriously, he places the creature in his bathtub. And suddenly, something strange happens inside Doug's mind. For the first time in a long time, he feels like his life might actually have purpose. That's where the story becomes both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable, because Doug begins developing feelings for the creature. Now, if you've seen movies like The Shape of Water, you might expect a strange but emotional romance to develop. But Cornack is clearly not interested in repeating that kind of story. The mermaid in this film isn't a misunderstood fantasy being waiting to be loved. It's a violent animal when the sedatives wear off. The creature vomits dark bile, screams with terrifying intensity, and behaves more like a wild predator than a magical being. Doug's fascination with it might feel sincere, but it's also deeply disturbing, and that's where the film really starts exploring its main theme. Doug doesn't fall in love with the creature because of who it is. He falls in love with it because of what it represents. The creature gives him something he hasn't had in a long time, a reason to wake up in the morning. That's a powerful idea, but it also reveals how broken Doug's life has become. Interestingly, the first half of Mermaid contains almost no traditional suspense. Despite having a monster at the center of the story, most scenes take place in broad daylight. The creature is rarely hidden. The audience sees it clearly, which removes the usual tension found in creature movies. Instead of fear, the movie focuses on mood. Cornack fills the film with an atmosphere that feels distinctly Floridian. Sun-bleached streets, neon lights from strip clubs, the sound of yacht rock drifting through the background. It's a surreal environment where everything feels slightly absurd and strangely beautiful at the same time. The supporting cast helps bring that world to life. Tom Arnold appears briefly in the opening scene, delivering a cameo that's both surprising and darkly funny. Robert Patrick and Kevin Dunn play two boat-owning criminals who feel like they've been pulled directly out of the strangest corners of Florida crime headlines. Their performances give the movie a bizarre energy that fits perfectly with the tone Cornack is trying to create. Then there's Kevin Nealon, who might deliver one of the most memorable performances in the film. He plays the cheerful new boyfriend of Doug's ex-partner. On the surface, he seems like the perfect contrast to Doug, stable, friendly, financially successful, but the movie slowly reveals that he might not be as different from Doug as he appears. In many ways, these side characters paint a clearer portrait of Florida than the main storyline does. They represent the strange ecosystem Cornack seems fascinated by, a world where sunshine, crime, absurdity, and desperation all coexist in the same place. The Mermaid disrupts that ecosystem. The creature's presence begins destabilizing everyone around Doug, forcing characters to confront situations they were never prepared for. Yet, strangely, the movie never fully builds toward the kind of explosive climax you might expect from a creature story. Instead, Doug's personal journey becomes the main focus. The movie gradually transforms into a story about someone waking up from emotional numbness. Doug begins recognizing how much damage he has caused in his life. He starts realizing that the version of himself he has been living with is unsustainable. Unfortunately, the resolution the story moves toward feels less imaginative than the strange premise that created it. Doug's final choices lean toward a more familiar revenge narrative, which feels somewhat predictable compared to the wild originality that defines much of the earlier film. Still, the journey there remains fascinating, largely because of the strange emotional tone Cornack manages to create. Mermaid might not be a perfect film, but it's undeniably unique. Tyler Cornack already proved with his previous movie, but boy, that he's not afraid to chase bizarre ideas. That film, which was famously named one of the best movies of 2020 by John Waters, followed a father who becomes a serial killer with an unbelievably absurd method of murder. Compared to that premise, Mermaid almost sounds normal, yet the film still carries Cornack's signature style. He's clearly interested in pushing uncomfortable ideas into comedic territory while exploring the strange psychology of flawed characters. And whether you love it or hate it, Mermaid is exactly the kind of movie that sparks conversation, because it isn't trying to be safe. It isn't trying to be conventional. It's trying to be memorable, and honestly, sometimes that's far more interesting than perfection. If you've already seen the trailer or heard about this movie, I'm curious what you think. Do you believe strange creature stories like this still have room to evolve in modern cinema? Or does this one sound too weird even by today's standards? Let me know what you think, because films like this usually divide audiences right down the middle. And if you enjoy exploring unusual movies, strange cinematic experiments, and the wild stories hiding behind Hollywood's latest releases, make sure you stay right here with Screen Radar. There's always another story waiting just beneath the surface.